Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Super Castlevania IV. Castlevania IV is a gothic horror action platformer developed and published by Konami. It was released on the Super Nintendo in 1991 and serves as a soft remake of the original NES Castlevania from 1986. I say soft because the game features a similar retelling of Simon Belmont's journey to hunt down and kill the vampire Dracula. The game's base mechanics, music, along with a handful of its final stages, are grounded in the original NES trilogy. My name is Mitchell, and I'll be your host for the evening. Here with me is fellow Oscarina voter Tyler. Tyler, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Here are the nominations for Castlevania IV. Best Pixel, 1991. Best Direction. Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement. Best Gameplay, Discovery and Expression. Best Level Design. Best Art Direction. Best Interface. Best Visual Immersion. Best Musical Score. Best Musical Track for Simon's theme. Best Musical Track for Waterfall. And Best Sound Atmosphere. So Castlevania IV managed to lead the first season of the Oscarinas with a whopping 12 nominations, more than any other at this year's ceremony, including 2 for Best Musical Track. And I'm out of breath from reading that much.
Yeah, this game really took the cake on all this stuff. It earned it for sure.
Oh yeah.
Even just experiencing it at a distance, like the thing has so much going for it. I mean, the art is great, the experience is great, the theme is obviously highly interesting. I mean, I think so, at least. I love the Gothic era. I love Dracula and Frankenstein, and it really tries to pull all that stuff together and make a pretty visceral experience through it.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is just to jump right in it because we have a lot to talk about. There's a ton of notes, a ton of categories, and we're going to do our best to just kind of speed things along. I think that was a good summation to start with. So the only other thing I want to make mention before we dive in fully is that when I was compiling my notes for this game, it was becoming very, very long, much longer than it is even here. And so what I decided to do was make an entire commentary on Castlevania IV, which is up on my other channel. I'll put a link in the description if you'd like to check that out. If you're voting, you don't have to watch that. It's just a bonus if you're curious. And it gives me a chance to talk about things that are less, I guess, game focused. I can be a little bit more abstract with it and be a little more cultural. And it just gives me a little bit more freedom. So I do have that up as well. So if you've seen that, thanks for watching. I hope it was interesting, and it kind of makes for, hopefully, a nice companion piece with this one.
And it's definitely a lot more extensive than we're going to be here because it's focused on the game itself rather than the game compared to other games, which is what the award ceremony is supposed to do. Plus, this is a compilation of everyone's notes, the ones who submitted it for any of these categories, and then your notes specifically, whether they came from the commentary, which obviously it's going to be a lot less than the commentary,
right?
But then what we both had opinions on in the game itself. So with that, we'll start off with direction. For those of you that know me, I really appreciate the hero's journey. I think it's something that's really formulated. Me as a creative person, I really latched onto it. And obviously, it's something that I share with millions and millions and millions of people. It's resonated through time. It's something that's kind of ageless, and this one is no different. Obviously, it has its own style, its own theme. It's set pretty beautifully in the opening cutscene, which sees a gravestone shatter, followed by scrolling text that brings us up to date on Dracula's continual revival and the Belmont's responsibility to forge a family of vampire hunters to defeat him. So we are then greeted by Simon unsheathing his whip at the gate to the castle's territory. And from that point forward, nothing interrupts the experience between you and the horrors of Castlevania.
So an important note to consider with Simon is that even though he's trained to kill a vampire, this might be your first time doing it. So as the years go on, it's supposed to be every 100 years. That's the premise, is when Dracula comes back. So you're probably, if it comes back in your generation, this is probably just the one time that you will fight him, which means the stakes are always high, because it's not as though you fought and slayed him, every 5 years. If that was the case,
Mhm.
you could mentally prepare for it better, but instead, it's always the first time for whatever Belmont has to face him. So I think that definitely adds some extra pressure.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, you're playing, or he's playing, I guess, through you, or vice versa. So it's really, I mean, you're the fish out of water, I guess, in that case, and it delves into that pretty well, and it immerses you in the world really well as well. It does a really good job of making you feel like this is a real place, as we were just looking at. That everything is so detailed to make you feel like you're actually there in this castle that Dracula's about to come back to life in.
Yeah, that's something we're going to touch upon quite frequently, is that this is very much a case where every single aspect of the game is doing its job, and because of it, they all culminate together for a pitch perfect experience.
Yeah,
There's also
agreed.
an enormous amount of buildup of tension until the final fight. So, in that first screen where you start, there's no enemies until Simon crosses the drawbridge, at which point there is no turning back. It's a foreshadow of the final sequence where Simon ascends the staircase and proceeds into Dracula's room. And in that case, he's walking from right to left, which is opposite to how you've been walking for pretty much the whole game. And then you get into the throne room, and it signifies a return from the point at which you came. A changed man after all the hell you've endured to get there. This kind of brings the story full circle.
Right. And it does a good job of visually telling the story of a hero's journey, which is to start out inexperienced, immature. You go through all this stuff, this growth, essentially, through adversity, and then you face the biggest battle of them all, and then you're ready to face the world, essentially, which is you. If I'm not mistaken, the game ends with him outside the castle, watching it burn to the ground. It's
Yeah.
very visually visceral, as I said, but it does a great job of telling that while also staying fairly simple within its way of storytelling. It's not text heavy, it's not exposition heavy, but it does a good job of making sure that that is told pretty clearly.
Well, and that's the real strength of it right there, is that it's an exercise in restraint. It doesn't need to have all these convoluted stuff thrown in, because the experience of his transformation is really something that happens within the player. It's your experience, and you actually get to take
Right.
that when you leave.
Which is probably why it did such a good job resonating with so many people.
Yeah. There's just something really beautiful and poetic about that. It's implied at the beginning that Dracula may never remain defeated, that this process of him rising from the grave and the Belmont's destiny to destroy him is bound to repeat. So it's kind of curious that this is exactly what happens at the end of the game. After you beat Dracula, Simon begins the journey all over again, and it's a perfect depiction of that sort of man versus monster. The tale is timeless. You could date it as far back as something like Beowulf. You become this highly trained, highly skilled warrior, and you face your first real opponent, and then if you defeat him, the cycle repeats. And it's a nice twist too on the generic knight slays a dragon and saves a princess archetype, because it's pulling from these different ideas. In particular, it's pulling Greek mythology, Universal horror pictures, and Indiana Jones. Those are kind of like three main ones that it tinkers with, and it just makes for a very original aesthetic.
Yeah, but at the same time, making sure that it has some really familiar callbacks. Like you said, it's got the whip, which very Indiana Jones of them, and it's used in the way that Indiana Jones does, and I'll let you get into that in a second. But also, like I said, it has Dracula, who's, obviously an incredibly recognizable figure, even by the name. Very Hammer horror kind of feel to it. But you get to experience it, and you get to walk through it, and it's a lot of fun that way.
It becomes hard to pinpoint exactly where each reference is coming from, because it'll just pull from whatever it wants to. Like they're having fun with it, they're sitting down, having a grand old time, and then someone says, "Hey, what about Medusa? We should throw Medusa heads in there." Hey, oh yeah! It just creates this really a joy to walk through.
Yeah, definitely. So let's jump back to the whip.
Yeah. So, and this will kind of be more of our thoughts on gameplay for challenge and achievement. And the whip is incredibly versatile. It has 3 basic uses. It's offensive in that you can strike enemies, or you can wiggle it about to create an area of effect to kind of protect yourself. It can also be used defensively. You can hold it out like a shield to absorb projectiles and kill small enemies like bats or crows. But you can also use it as a tool. It can be used to latch onto hooks and swing yourself across gaps, giving a sense of adventure. It's kind of like Indiana Jones, where you just you lash it on to the hook and then you swing across. It just adds some much needed flavor. And really, what's so great about this is it's all linked to one button. And this is something I kind of expanded on in my commentary, but basically, if you can boil your game down to just 3 buttons, which this one does, I'd say that's a testament to your quality, because that's hard to do. I mean, this is an expansive action experience, but you don't need anything else. The whip just does so much for you.
I'm not sure what prompted this decision. It may very well have been a limited capability of throwing more things into it, because obviously you have your sub-weapons, but then you have this one, which is the main one, which accomplishes multiple different things. So you don't need like a sword and a shield and all that stuff. It's just this, and then it accomplishes the job of those things itself.
Yeah.
While also doing more, and it's all accomplished in one weapon, and like you said, with 3 buttons. So I think it may be a testament to the fact that they were just limited in their resources, but also to their creativity to work with what they had. And they did a brilliant job. I mean, I'd like to be the fly on the wall to see what prompted all these decisions to be made to end in this result, but it was wonderful regardless.
Yeah, one of the really innovative steps they took with this particular entry is that you can whip in 8 directions, and it's also a really long whip, so this puts virtually every enemy within reach of you. And that's really cool because it just gives you this greater sense of feeling. If you swing the whip very briefly, it won't hit very hard, but if you hold down the button just a little bit, then Simon will put more force into it, and that's when you'll get the high damage. So there's lots of nuances that go into how this whip functions, and you can tell it wasn't just program the basic swipe and then call it a day. Even when I looked at other games too, most of them had basically a single solitary animation, and Simon's is so much more detailed, where he brings it up and then casts it, and it becomes a bit of iconography. I'm kind of reaching off into the visual department a little bit, but it's just such a good feeling. It just really has that game feel pinned down very well. You can also use the whip. It's basically an active hitbox all the time, which is awesome because sometimes you can just hold it out in front of you and just let it dangle onto an enemy or something, and then it'll kill them. And it's reminiscent how in old games, enemies hurt you simply by touching you, and you can never do that. But the whip is that will always hurt enemies no matter what it's doing. And I love the thought that they said, no, you this whip means business, and so you get to feel all that sense of power come through.
Castlevania, the player's revenge. Which makes it fun. I mean, it is kind of entertaining on some level just to let enemies kill themselves. Obviously, a lot of the AI works pretty well for this era of game, but there are some instances where I noticed when you were fighting the mummy, you could kind of just keep yourself at a decent level, like you were one platform below him or something, and you were able to just nail his feet, and you were under his shooting range, so you were staying out of danger's way essentially. He also teleports around the room, so it's not something you can just spam until he's dead. You do have to still deal with him as he jumps around.
Yeah, positioning is super important, in this game, and as opposed to, I guess, too much of your actual strategy. It's mostly just making sure that you're putting yourself in the right range of your opponent to make sure that you're hitting them with the maximum amount of damage that you need.
Right,
and you're doing this while avoiding traps and everything. Yeah.
There's different parts of the whip that will, like, when you're holding it there and just dangling it around or swinging in a circle, essentially working it as its shield, it does less damage when it comes into contact with enemies as opposed to when you're actually attacking them, correct?
Yes.
Gotcha. Which also makes it interesting because, like you said, you can let them walk into it, but it's going to take a lot longer than if you're actually actively fighting them the way you're supposed to.
Yeah, it's a soft defense for smaller or weaker enemies. If you try to use it on a big boy, that's not going to pan out as well. And the enemies can get pretty devious with where they're placed in the game. They will wait at the end of long walks over collapsing bridges with the sole intention of slashing you over the edge until you plummet to your death. And you have to be very reactive to this, and you need good control of your whip to either go forceful and meet them early and take them out, or make sure you space out enough time or balance it out with a sub-weapon to kind of finish him off so that way you can approach safely.
Speaking of combat with the enemies, there's some cheap deaths, such as when enemies wait at the end of a long run across a gap. Like you were saying, they kind of just sit there and wait till you're in a difficult position and get kicked off. But like you said earlier about the Indiana Jones thing, it's kind of harkening back to that, where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And this may test your patience, but obviously it adds grit to this game, and it's this harrowing adventure, and it really leans into that to make you feel like this is something hard-earned, and you got to put in the time to do it. And it does a great job of making sure that you feel like you're working for your win. And it adds to that build-up that you had mentioned at the beginning as well.
Yeah, because the game has 11 stages, and they're so richly detailed that it makes a lot of sense why there isn't more of them. And I think if you were to have more, it would kind of pose a little bit of a problem, because if you had more, then the game, like, let's say you remove the cheap deaths and you make the game longer. At that point, what would happen is it would start to cause a little bit of, not fatigue, but exhaustion, I think. It would just be overstimulation at that point. So instead, you get a few deaths in there that are a little frustrating, but then you re-strategize and you have infinite continues, and your lives will revive you at a checkpoint. So it's usually not too consequential. And there's a password system in it, but it's very intuitive, very easy to write down. So it's really easy to pick up back where you were. And in that process, that's when you're struggling against the game, but you overcome that challenge, and then it becomes something that impacts you, because you can breathe that sigh after you get through a difficult part, and then you go, okay, well, I made it through that, so that's one place I never have to think about again. And it's, it has that impression left upon you, and that cements it in your memory as something really noteworthy to go through. It's like an adventure, right? If you didn't fall off a cliff every now and again, it wouldn't feel like an adventure. You usually don't die if it's in a movie, but this is a game, so this is how it's translated here. And one of my main points kind of with gameplay is sort of also with direction, is that because the quality of the entire game is so rich and engaging, the sound of bones cracking, the entrancing music, the lovingly crafted environments, it sparks you into making another attempt. The narrative is spurring you on, so its gameplay can't really be removed from the game because you're incentivized for all the other reasons and then plus some.
Right, and it emulates what it would be, physically. If you were going through this, it tries to do as good a job as it can to make sure that you're feeling like you're actually doing this. You're actually overcoming these obstacles to get to your goal, this family-oriented goal that's been passed down to you through the generations of slaying this one man, or not a man.
I mean, he is monstrous. Make no mistake.
He's he may once have been a man. Who knows? We'll have to explore that later.
These are all his monstrosities he's summoned from
They
the depths of hell. So yeah.
they are, which leads us into this next point about where these bosses come into play. So most of these bosses come with multiple phases, and while many of them have difficult to dodge attacks, they can be bested with basically nothing but your guts if you can get good enough. So again, that persistence is something that's going to pay off if you have it. The other aspect is that you are incentivized to explore the world for sub-weapons and then kill enemies with said sub-weapons in order to power it up. So each one has 2 power-ups, correct?
Well, yes. So basically, when you get a sub-weapon, you can use it, like let's say you get a knife, you throw the knife, once it makes contact with the enemy, then you can throw another one. The power-up allows you to throw 2, and then the second tier power-up allows you to throw 3 before you need to refresh, essentially.
Right. Who isn't good enough to throw 3 knives at once at one enemy? If you can bring a powered-up sub-weapon with a stack of hearts to a boss, most of them will be at your mercy. And all of that means that the game rewards players for doing everything, which apparently isn't that hard to do, which was one of your complaints in the video. I remember it just kind of gives it to you after you've lost the sub-weapon upgrades. But I mean, if you lose it late, right before you face a boss or something, then that could damage your ability against him. Either way, it was an interesting little tidbit there. But learning level layouts and enemy placements, exploring, leveraging your abilities and attack option, eventually these culminate into an action-packed dance that's whip-smacking good. I didn't write that, I would like to point out. I apologize for that. That's horrible that I said it at all.
I mean, you went into the script, so you could have let me handle that one.
I didn't know that that was there. That's horrible.
Well, that was placed just for you, I hope you know.
Oh, aren't you sweet? So yeah, anyway, all that to say, the bosses have a good variety to them. Good. What's the word I'm looking for? It's a good set of difficulties to each one.
Yeah.
It makes you feel like you've earned it by the time you've beaten them.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say to put a bow on our challenge and achievement conversation is that, especially in comparison with the other nominees, this one I think is the most structurally sound. There's no point at the game that becomes overly or unreasonably hard, except for maybe that very, very, very brief point at the end when you're climbing up to Dragula's Keep. But I think that's just my problem, and I think it's an old game. There's going to be someone, like every person is going to have a point or two, a boss or whatever it is, a part where they just struggle with it, and then it becomes this hurdle to get over. But there's enough of them that follow a similar pattern that you can kind of learn what you're supposed to do, and that becomes your moment to overcome. And then the rest of them are more or less sound, especially when we're looking at something like Super C or UN Squadron, which is utterly brutal. This game is the most fair, and it's funny because people who are retro enthusiasts or played it growing up, they cite it as among the easier Castlevanias, if not an easy game in general. But modern players have a real hard time with it. It's merging kind of 2 different identities, and for me, I think it's firmly in the middle. I think there are some places that are pretty cheap and that get a little rough, but I think they kind of add to the experience. I think they add much needed flavor and variety. I think they deepen the emotional connection you have with it, and I think the game would be less without them. And I don't think they detract. I don't think it makes the game. I don't think it's too easy or too hard. I think it's a nice blend.
Well, a lot of times with that particular set of problems, it creates a memory. I mean, that's something you're going to remember experiencing. And even though you and I didn't necessarily grow up with this game, I remember hearing about it quite a bit. Even playing it now, it's something that's going to stick with you just because it has that. It gives it character.
Yeah, and not in a way, again, it's not excessive, I wouldn't say. And this could be an opinion point of it. I mean, you might feel differently in playing it yourself, but it was definitely a game I beat multiple times, whereas I couldn't even beat UN Squadron once for this award show. Like, it was just kicking my butt so hard.
That uninformed, man. What a failure. All right, so let's move to the next segment then with that, and that would be gameplay, discovery, and expression. So this is the fourth entry in the Castlevania series, and it is the most polished thus far, bringing in an improved sense of control and greatly improved sense of visual fidelity. So obviously this game expresses itself in a very unique way compared to other games of the time and to its own predecessors, obviously, which I have to admit that I've not played or even experienced, so I can't speak to them. But obviously this one itself did such a great job that it resonated with a large community, and not just the ones that had already played previous Castlevania games, and even aged well enough to make an impression on us today.
It's very unique among Castlevania entries because on the one hand, it replicates what the first one was doing in that it zeroes back down to just one character that you play. There's no side characters. It's linear. You just play from the beginning to end, and that's the game. But it's also very different in that you have that 8-directional whip control, which very much changes how the experience comes through. And after this game released, the whip control evidently didn't go over super well, and so all subsequent Castlevania games would abandon the 8-directional movement. And it didn't make a return except when it was kind of too late, I would say, because then you're in 3D environments, so then it doesn't really apply. So it's interesting to me that the narrative shifted, and it reminds me a lot today of games that come out that riff or do something very different than their previous entries. And then sometimes people don't like that, and so then there's this effort to go back to it. And usually that's a good thing, but this was a change that I think actually worked well for it, and I think it's because it's different. I think if you go into it looking for that hard knuckle Castlevania brutal difficulty, you're not quite going to get that here because you just have so much power.
I think there's something to be said there about just experiencing it. It is a rather, like I was saying earlier, is a hyper detailed game, and I imagine they wanted you to get more of an experience rather than suffering through an immensely hard game, which may have lent to that. I'm not sure. Like I said, I have not done a whole bunch of research in the development itself or why they made the decisions that they made, but ultimately I appreciate all the decisions that were made, and I'm a sucker for the theme, and the general story I think is fairly interesting, simple though it is. It's something kind of timeless in its simplicity, and I think that's great.
Yeah, the stages include a constant introduction of new enemy types with interesting designs and attack patterns. And this helps the exploration by helping you feel like you're checking places out, like you're getting to see new aspects of Dracula's castle. But you're also able to explore in that you can whip the walls for pork chop, because that's obviously where any good count should store their pork chops, is within brick walls.
Where do you get your pork chop?
The oven, typically, after the grocery store.
No, come on. No, you get it. With a whip and a wall.
There are a few secrets. One of my favorites is the one in the mansion before you get to the castle, and you go through the floors and there's a ghost walking around and his ghost dog, and if you whip the dog it'll die, and then he kind of crouches down and weeps over it. It's this really sad, sentimental moment that has very little context, but you don't really need it because he's a ghost. He's trapped in whatever he was doing at the moment of death. And there's all sorts of ghosts in that level, so it's interesting to wonder what happened to them. Like, did Dracula just drink all their blood and now they're just left to roam? But it's a nice little bit of environmental storytelling all the same, and that's part of the direction, it's part of the exploration.
So in the spirit of Castlevania in general, considering, everybody's done their review, their article, this is something that we were planning on doing for about a week now. I went back and picked up the Castlevania show on Netflix. I had watched the first season, didn't have the second season, so I went and got the second season. Took me a while to get into it, but now that I've finally done it, I think I'm on episode 3 or 4 or something like that. Anyway,
Nice.
There's a character in there that is one of the human followers of Dracula, and I'm not really sure what he's based on. I'm imagining that they just pulled that one bit from this game and just kind of expounded. But it has some Frankenstein vibes to it a little bit. Basically, this character when he's a kid. I don't remember his name. Is that his name? He's the one with the dog. When he's a kid, the dog dies in the field, and he brings it back to life with these two like coin things that he has. He's like a forge master, I think is what they called him.
Yeah, so I know the Forge Masters do show up in other Castlevania games, but nevertheless, it's a similar repeat narrative that you're mentioning.
Yeah, and it seems like they pulled quite a bit out of this one scene from this game, because I noticed as we were watching it again, I was like, oh man, that's basically the story of this character that is in the show. Must be what they watched to inspire it. But he goes on to, make all these other characters or these creatures to bring them back to life and things. But the ones, he has the dog when he's a kid, and then he has another dog when he's older. It's a different dog, but kind of similar. It's dead, and it's like missing the skin of its arms and stuff, and it's like two bones that he's walking. It's really interesting, really odd, but it's a good idea and a good concept. And I noticed that it was a similar concept, and it seems like, he died a long time ago, and he's a ghost forced to live with his undead dog, whatever. And then you take that away from him. It's sad, but it's.
I mean, he's a ghost though. He's got to move on.
Yeah, I know. He's got to move on. Get out of there, man. Like, come on, get over it. You had your chance.
I'm not sure he had much of a chance, but yes, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, maybe he's stuck forever now, and his one companion is gone. You jerk. Screw you, Simon.
Simon!
Dog had what was coming to it, so it was that.
Yeah, this is what I was about to say. Castlevania is a very inspiring series, and this one I think is one of my favorites. This was actually my entry point to the series. I've played a couple others now, but I played it in college when I was sort of theory crafting for the awards. So similar situation as ActRaiser. This was also one that I played, and I fell in love with it. And not immediately. I was playing through, and I couldn't pinpoint exactly what one thing was working so well. And the conclusion was that everything. That is the answer. The whole thing is just this beautifully crafted masterpiece.
It is.
One of the things, and then we can kind of use this to bridge into level design here, is that just to give you a sense for how much there is here, you have 69 enemies, including bosses, for a 4.5 to 5 hour game. For comparison's sake, Super Mario World has 73, but that's for 6 to 7 hour game. A good hour and a half longer, and an hour here is like 20%. So the fact that it's in close proximity to that really goes to show just how many enemies and new things you're discovering comes up. You only have 11 stages, but the final two are something of a two-parter, since the final stage is mostly a series of showdowns with the Count's supreme henchmen. Many of the earlier stages actually shift and change, such as the farmhouse and the empty ruins in stage 1, and then you have the swamp and the river in stage 2, and then you have the waterfall and the underwater city in stage 3. So there's a lot of transformation going on. You're crossing these different thresholds. And the other cool thing that's happening here is that for the stages outside of Dracula's Keep, you're mostly progressing from a linear fashion right to left, or I mean left to right, or going upwards. And then once you get into Dracula's Keep, there's a lot of spaces where you're dropping down, like you drop down into the cellar, and then you have to essentially claw your way back up to get back to Dracula. And so vertical level design is not only more complicated to build, just mentally, if you've ever tried to design a level, thinking of it in terms of that extra dimension is really tough. And the other thing that it does is it hits us more emotionally. If you're just moving left and right, it's a bit more passive. But if you go up and down, it triggers your emotional responses a little faster. This is why Mario is so much fun to play, because he's very bouncy and things are going up and down all the time. And you don't have that as much. I mean, you're walking on stairs for a lot of it, but that kind of slows the pace down and gets you more grounded with the world. And then the action can really become center stage, because you've got these bigger sprites, which is not something that everybody loves, but I quite like it because Simon is a huge sprite, and then the enemies are big to match him. And so when you encounter an enemy or two, it's like you're in a duel, and then you defeat them, and it just makes the whole situation so much more impactful when they explode or burn up or something like that after you defeat them. So it's just a really viscerally engaging moment-to-moment gameplay.
Yeah, and obviously that's a little more psychological than I think we're getting in the Oscarinas, but it does lead into the level design, which is conveniently our next topic.
I branched off slightly. This is all level design.
It is. That's true. Maybe we should put in the psychology of the game for the next round of Oscarinas.
Well, I'll tell you what, psychology does play a role in a lot of this, because for my next point, as I said that like it was the next trick out of my hat, the game cleverly uses its environment to kill you by placing monsters under rugs, or you got the clubbing knight who can pop up from behind towers, or on the opposite side of windows, or even within empty portraits. He's one of those examples that demonstrates how well Castlevania IV is able to utilize its space effectively. And this is a really cool thing. In New Game Plus, when you're going through the farm, there's these big open windows and you can see out, and I thought it was just set dressing, but when you go into it on hard mode for the second run, it'll put those clubbing monsters behind it. So it's just really thoughtful how they will take the space that you're in and put an enemy that fits within the context of the narrative. And like I said, it's the environment. Like the rug monster, he pops up under you and he's just trying to push you into the spikes above, and all you have to do is duck to not get killed. But it can catch you off guard, and it's a smart way to just kind of enlighten and re-alert the player and make you be like, oh wow, goodness, there's so much I gotta pay attention to.
If there's one thing that this game gets entirely right, it's the theme and thematics, and it definitely leans into that even with small details like that. Like I said before, it may just be them trying to cram stuff in to make sure that you get the experience while maybe being limited in other areas, but they did it so masterfully that it's hard to tell what the reason was.
A lot of it too doesn't need the explanation because it's just Dracula and he has mystical powers that you don't really have access to. Like when you're going through his library, you can see the books flapping around, and then of course they try to kill you because why wouldn't they? But it just brings that environment. The spaces are so much more lively than you would otherwise think of in a lot of other games at the time.
And honestly, when have you not been afraid that some book was going to fly out and try and kill you? I'm always afraid of that.
Well, I think we're kind of brushing up on our visual topics. Should we go there now?
Let's do it. We're moving on to art direction.
Yep.
All right. Art direction. Capturing the multi-layered aesthetic of Gothic horror, Universal Hollywood Pictures, and Greek mythology is no small feat, but Castlevania blends them all gracefully. It doesn't rely on any of them as a crutch, but instead harnesses them in order to build a mythos for Dracula that's larger and uniquely original compared to the other incarnations of the character. Indiana Jones was the inspiration for the whip and adds a flavorful twist to the conventional knight-slaying dragon legend. So, this leads into how this game looks. And as we've said multiple times throughout this video, it's incredible. It's on all levels and in a hyper-detailed fashion. It is extremely immersive. And this whole game, especially within this whole game just looks like the guys who made it just had a bunch of fun with it. Looks like the idea room was a lot of fun. It looks like the work was a lot of fun. Probably some guys were just like, what if we just put in this? And it seems like they were just gonna go for it. Why not? It just, you feel it as you play it, as you watch it, as you experience it. It just comes through, and art direction is definitely one of the biggest parts of the game that shines.
Well, Konami was a powerhouse back in that era. They had so many great classics. We're talking Contra, this game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, just a whole bunch of different games. And yeah, I agree. It's an absolute treat for the eyes. The backdrops are amazing. There's often 3 or 4 different layers. So when you're walking through, let's say, a forest, you'll have clumps of trees and then another layer of clumps of trees, slightly smaller or moved around a bit. So that way it just creates depth and a thickness there. that you would expect from a forest. And then you have like the rolling clouds. So it's just so much. One of the other examples I really like is how they use color and placement of light to separate different parts of the background. And they can also use that to reinforce mood. It's especially noticeable in the submerged city, where the sky is a vivid purple. But you can also see it in the castle, where the pillars are blue and violet, and it creates the illusion of a three-dimensional space. Because, remember, at the time, you don't have a lot of other tools that you can use, so just color choice has to become really important. I thought they did a really nice job of just pulling you through in that way. It's just really, really nice on the eyes.
Yeah, it is. It's very visually, it's a visual feast, as it were. So yeah, even if you don't play this game, I'd recommend just kind of maybe watching a playthrough or checking out the commentary that Mitch did, just to experience it, just to see it, because it does look really, really great.
Yeah, and I'm endlessly surprised of how many things there are to see. Every time I play through it, I see something new, especially when I'm going through the footage. I'll stop and go, wait, what was that? I can't believe that detail is there. That's crazy. And the category's description for art direction, it awards games that create a unified look. And given the fact that Castlevania is pulling from a myriad of sources, and that the combined vision of all of these differing identities creates this singular vision of a grim dark hero quest, it's really makes it a worthwhile contender. The tone is not only united, but it elegantly sidesteps being overly generic, graphic, or otherwise inconsistent. I imagine pulling in gothic horror, hammer horror, Universal Pictures. It's a lot of different aesthetics at play here, Indiana Jones, but they just mesh so well together, and you don't notice that at all. It becomes its own unique identity, just leaning on its source material with absolute passion.
Yeah, that's a good word to describe this game. It's just passionate. You could feel the passion coming through the people that made it, passion that they had for the source material, and it inspires passion too for the game, obviously. That's why it has such a large following.
So should we talk about interface?
Let's do it. Moving on to our next topic. Assigning so many crucial actions to a single button is quite good for getting players to acclimate, because they have significantly less to memorize and instead can focus more on learning by feeling their way through. So like we were talking about before, they crammed a bunch of experience into 3 buttons, which obviously had to have been a really difficult feat, but they did it really well, especially with the whip. Which, as you talked about, has a really large and active hitbox. You can swing it 8 ways. Okay, yeah, like you were saying before. So when enemies touched you, you got hurt, but this one kind of flips it around, at least when you're using the whip. So it was kind of a turning old games on its head. It was really good.
Yeah, the whip really can't be understated here. I know we talked about it to some extent in gameplay, but it's applicable here too, because it's the main way in which you're touching and interacting with the world. You just have so much control, and it's not difficult to gain control of the whip. The difficulty is in paying attention to all the things coming at you, making sure you're spaced appropriately, making sure you're using sub-weapons to back you up if you need a little bit of extra damage. That's where the real challenge comes in. But the actual feel, and this is the one game on this list that I think has really strong game feel. It's what keeps me coming back, is it just the sensation is so good of swinging whips and hearing that crack and everybody dying just at your mercy. It's just really nice. So basically any game from this era will involve your character attacking directly in front of them, especially if you're talking about Mega Man, ActRaiser, Super Ghouls and Ghosts. That's just a few. The only game I found that was similar is Super C, and that's another Konami game. That does allow you to attack in 8 directions, but that's with guns, and so this is with melee. But it's a similar philosophy, and you have to kind of measure that a little bit more. And distance still becomes a factor, even though you don't have, a gun for extra range. But it gives the designers more opportunities to present enemies and obstacles, which in turn make the scenario more dynamic and also creates a deeper sense of strength within the player, since they have enough functionality to combat the scenario. But you never feel like they are at the mercy of old tech or bad controls. Sometimes when you're playing retro games, it can get a little stiff, and what you're doing is kind of rough, but this plays almost like a modern game. It's just right on the cusp of one. It's quite nice to play.
Yeah, like I said, it's just very innovative on how many options you have with the few options that you have, in a weird way of saying it. Like, you only have
Yeah.
a whip and 2
Right.
sub-weapons, but the amount of ways that you can use those things, maybe not the sub-weapons so much, but it's so innovative in the way that it uses these things that you don't feel like you're limited. And in that, it's not stale. It doesn't get stale. It kind of keeps you interested. It keeps you moving, even though it's only 3 buttons and 1 main weapon.
Because I do definitely feel limited when I'm playing other games. There's always this sense that it's a bit stiff. It was especially noticeable in ActRaiser. I mean, ActRaiser's interface was also really good, but for different reasons because it was blending genres. But in terms of its side-scrolling approach, it's pretty straightforward. But this is just on a completely a whole nother level. Yeah, the whip very much just becomes a natural extension of what you would intuit. So it behaves like a whip, with maybe a dash of Hollywoodization thrown in for flavor.
Of course. I mean, why wouldn't you have that? It does give you a sense of, I don't know, swashbuckling, but at the same time you're in a gothic horror setting, so it's just kind of, it's an expert mix. I'm assuming it was very risky to take in the beginning, but they pulled it off really well.
Mm-hmm. The other thing we should talk about with interface is, for the most part, it's pretty clean. You've got your health bar. I've noticed very few enemies actually only deal a single point of damage. They all seem to do much more than that, but it seems as though that decision was made because when you get hit, you can notice more easily how much damage, or that it's actually had a big impact because it's taking off more bars of health. So that's a pretty interesting use of that. There's a few things like your score points and your time, both of which are pretty dated at this point, and if it was made today, I don't think they would be there. But it's kind of nostalgic at the same time, and it doesn't really distract too much. You can pretty much just ignore it.
I'd argue that if they made it today, I'd want it to be made that way, just to preserve its originality.
Yeah, I kind of feel similarly. I kind of like that that's there just because it reminds you of old times. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing we should probably mention is the map, which always opens with the full image of Dracula's keep and the pathways below, and then it zooms in to show you how much progress you've made, giving you a surge of confidence and a momentary respite before you steel yourself once more. And
Nice.
I talked about this in my commentary, and I kind of used Super Ghouls and Ghosts as a less good example, but that one's just so much more boring. The map isn't very dynamic, and the camera doesn't move in an interesting way. It just pans across, and this one just pushes in, and then it shows this little trail. It just is encapsulating the whole experience. It's documenting where you're going, and it gives you that little bit of momentum. It's just nice. It's a nice little bit of, it's a nice addition that doesn't need to be there, but it helps you contextualize how much progress you're making.
Maybe it's a bit of a flex as well, just saying, hey, we can do this. And it's not only cool to see the castle and just to kind of get a feel for that giant scale that you're in, with the fortress and, you know, where you are, but then also to go in and see, all right, these are all the levels and this is the one you're on right now. So you're seeing how far you got and how far you've come. So it does a good job of visually representing that.
Agreed.
All right, so with that, should we move on to our next topic here?
Yeah, let's get into the visual atmosphere. So it's been difficult to not actually talk about this one. Every time we bring up a point, it seems like I have something to say about the visual atmosphere that I'm trying to stave off. So now we get to do it.
And just to recap, obviously this is up for a number of nominations, but we start with Best Direction, Best Gameplay, Challenge and Achievement, Best Gameplay again for Discovery and Expression, Best Level Design, Best Art Direction, Best Interface, and now here we are in Best Visual Immersion. So take it away.
I think the best way to address this is to just throw at you a bunch of tiny little details that are completely unnecessary, but just make the whole atmosphere completely dripping with feeling and mood. So when you're in the chandelier sequence, the flames of the candles actually sway with the motion of the chandeliers rocking back and forth. In the cellar, skeletons wiggle in their chains in the background, while others emerge from the walls and claw at you. There's ghosts floating around in the treasure room, and gold scatters around from your feet. The clock tower really sells all of this because not only are you walking on the gears and swinging on conveyor belts, you also have to avoid a giant cog that comes rolling at you. And my favorite part about it is when you get to the end, you can see the inner workings of the clock tower by peering through the windows from the outside.
Yeah, and that may lend to the point that Corbett was making, that essentially it's a working tower or working chamber or whatever, and it kind of alludes to something in the background working and maybe pulling you deeper. But there's also that one level that he also may be referencing, the one that spins as you're walking through it, which is, I would argue, is one of the few things that's almost given me motion sickness just watching the thing, but it is visually interesting for sure.
Yeah, that one seems to get you every time. I like that moment. I think it's really cool and weird. It kind of gives Dracula's castle this Howl's Moving Castle effect. It's more than just a generic castle. Like, he quite literally has a clock tower within his keep. And evidently, in reading an interview of the original creator of Castlevania, he said that the purpose of the clock tower is it's actually holding up Dracula's castle and it's powered by him. So when you kill Dracula and you see the castle crumble, it's only the tower leading up to his keep that crumbles, because that's where the clock tower was, and that was the only part of it that required his power to function. The rest actually remains and just becomes ruins. And it's such a weirdly nuanced detail that he was thinking of, but it just goes to show how much thought was put into a 16-bit game, or in that case, an 8-bit game.
Yeah, I mean, probably not something you'd pick up on yourself unless you'd played this game a million times over and just happen to notice that small detail, but that is pretty interesting. I do enjoy when people put it in there, regardless if they think that the audience is going to pick it up.
Right.
They just think, this is where it comes from, and I'm going to put it in there because this is important to me. And whether someone finds out or not is irrelevant. It's really just there because he wanted it to be.
That coincides with what you said earlier about passion, about having the freedom to just express the things that you think are significant for the story world, and it's up to us to notice them. And if you don't, I think you also feel them somehow, and it leaves this subtle emotion with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it leaves that emotion more strongly when you actually hear what the reason was. I mean, just by hearing that, I'm getting it essentially third party. You heard it from him and I'm hearing it from you, but it makes me appreciate the game all the more just because that was in there in the first place.
Yeah. There's some other cool uses of Mode 7 as well. There's that room where you have to latch onto a hook, and then the screen rotates and you end up getting thrust onto the ceiling, but there's spikes all around. That's really cool. And then there's another one where when you're fighting the Golem boss, every time you hit him, he kind of shrinks a little bit and he gets smaller and smaller until he eventually just becomes nothing. Just even moments like those. Some people say it's kind of gimmicky in places. I don't think so. I think that just makes it really... It just makes the encounter stand out a little bit more. It adds to that adventure feel, right? You don't... An adventure is, I think, something that's greater than the sum of its parts. It's not going to be a single thing that you have to do in order to be called an adventure. You would need multiple things, and those things would all have to be uniquely different. That makes it very dynamic.
Shall we move on?
Yes, so now we're at a list of 4 nominations in music, so we're gonna have a lot to go through.
Oh my gosh. It is amazing, though. Obviously, we're not officially recognized as an award ceremony or whatever, but even within our group, this game has some serious recognition on so many fronts. It really is a testament to the experience you get with playing it. And that is, I mean, were I someone who worked on this game, I would be very flattered.
Yeah, if I could say that the gameplay is unique because of the whip and its functionality and that there's nothing like it on the Super Nintendo, I would also say that the visual aesthetic is truly unique as well, and it also extends to the score. The music has this organ meets gothic horror and adventure and jazz, and it's all very strangely put together, but it's quite memorable, and there's nothing like it on the Super Nintendo catalog.
Yeah, it definitely is put together in a way that's you're not going to forget anytime soon.
Yeah, it's a nice balance of dark, foreboding places as well as whimsical fantasy, making each track a genuine match for each location. And that's location because some stages can have multiple set pieces to walk through, and there's a new piece of music to accompany that. Uh, the kind of big example for me here is Waterfall, which is up for Best Musical Track. It plays in a sequence in which the player has to climb a waterfall, and the motion of going upwards is that symbol of ascension, of conquering fears and finding inner strength. It's such a small moment in the game, but I remember the first time hearing it being really taken away. And I think a lot of people might have expected something like Submerged City to be nominated, but I went with Waterfall just because it meant a little bit more to me. I think it was special when I first heard it. It really was one of the pieces that pulled me into the kind of rich, gothic, deep feeling that the game conveys.
Yeah, and even just listening to it on its own is quite a trip for sure. I appreciate because it's so unusual and unique. Um, but it's just a really good, like even Simon's theme, for instance, is very uplifting and heroic, but in a strange way. Like it's not very conventional, even for the time. But it's enjoyable. It's a fun listen, just for the listen of it.
Yeah, it takes the villain, the classic villain playing an organ, and makes it your anthem. So you're like seizing that. It's kind of awesome.
Which kind of goes with that dark hero kind of, I wouldn't say aesthetic, theme, I suppose. Which is it's kind of leaning into, I mean, it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't go too much into the backstory of Simon and all that kind of stuff, except for the fact that you're part of a family and you're essentially raised to defeat Dracula. So in a way, you're almost acting in a villainous sort of way. You don't know much about Dracula, you just know that he's evil from what you've been told and raised to believe, and you're going to kill this thing. But you're also in a gothic horror setting. I don't know how much thought this was put into this, particular aspect of the game, so I'm not going to try and delve too deep into theories, but it does do that, where it's like, well, you're part of this aesthetic, you're part of this gothic horror game. We're going to add an organ in here and make it more uplifting and heroic, since that's who you are, and it doesn't break the theme of the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and the jazz, I think, is a really important inclusion, because jazz is it's not ambient, but it commands your attention much less than a lot of other music. You get what I'm saying? It can kind of it can vibe with your escapades much easier, and somehow is able to blend these other different things into one. The theme the score is based around and the way in which it is executed perfectly encapsulates the many mixed genres that would otherwise be confused. You got gothic horror, Greek mythology, monster movies, and Indiana Jones, and it all demands a carefully crafted score if you're going to make all that work. The organ beeps merge universal horror pictures with their heroic melody, perhaps inspired from Indiana Jones. And then the music doesn't sound like either, though. Its spirit is wrapped up in all of these things and treads ambitiously with originality, such as jazz. And there's, of course, that iconic flute solo in Submerged City, where he just goes ham on that flute.
Which may also be in the vein of John Williams, but who knows? There are multiple music tracks for each map screen. You see the map after each stage, and the music for them subtly builds in tension as the closer you get to the end. Obviously, the closer you get to facing Dracula. And it does a really good job of making sure that themes are intertwined to get there. I think you made a comment as well, which I hope you didn't make this point later, but you're listening to Dracula's theme when you're facing him, and then as you're winning, and then as you beat him, your theme fades into play.
Yeah,
it does a really good job of making those themes similar to not only mimicking themselves and add to the theme of the game, but also to show that victory is now yours. The thing that you've been fighting so hard to get to is now something that you're victorious over, and the music goes right into playing with that.
Well, and that's beautiful too, because it brings the whole story full circle. You actually start hearing Dracula's theme in the prologue when he rises from the grave, and then it plays Simon's theme when you're in stage 1, and then the two play out again. You enter Dracula's chamber, and his music cuts in, you start to win, and then your music cuts in, and then it closes out the scene with the ending theme, which I don't know how much I should play here, but it's just a really powerful piece that, I mean, it perfectly closes out the journey and just brings you a sense of satisfaction and catharsis that is really unparalleled. Yeah, the fact that it has 2 nominations in Best Musical Track really indicates an exceptional score. And as if that wasn't enough, 2 musical track nods doesn't even tell us the whole story, since Bloody Tears and Vampire Killer are also iconic pieces heavily associated with the series and gaming as a whole. I mean, Vampire Killer in particular is played in a seminal moment when you cross a crumbling bridge before Dracula's chamber. It fills you with a sense of finality and purpose as you cross the final threshold against the backdrop of a moonlit lake. It's just exquisite.
Like we said, it's a masterpiece. Multiple levels.
The only other thing I would say is that you're not wrong about John Williams' inspiration. I don't know if the composers heard or listened to him in particular, but they did listen to like Baroque and some older composers. There's one in particular, I can't remember his name now, and it's driving me crazy that I did a bunch of research. I mean, I digged, and I just could not find it, but the theme for Waterfall, that track is very similar to another piece, but it's this older song, and that one's a little more, it didn't like hold the depth as much, is the best way I could describe it, because the Waterfall theme is just, here's Simon at his low point, and like you brought up earlier with the hero's journey, there's always that moment when the hero has to be submerged in water when they're at the lowest point of the experience, and that kind of turns up here in the Waterfall. He's just going through water and being transformed with the weight of this impactful music. It's just a really powerful scene.
Is that song just pure classical, or is that another score?
It was just classical, yeah. It wasn't for like a film or anything, because it's old.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, I can't remember who the composer was, and it's noticeably different, but you can hear just slightly the kind of that piano resonance goes
similar
through.
theme. Gotcha.
Yeah. So it was clear that he probably listened to it and then incorporated that to get that emotion that he wanted out of it.
Well, as with musical themes and the scoring, something else goes into that, and that is the sound atmosphere, which is our next category. So you have a couple of facts here. The entire auditory catalog is comprised of 156 Halloween sound effects. For comparison, Zelda: A Link to the Past has a 129 sound effect, and that game is twice as long on average. So there's unique sounds for every door creak and chandelier groan. The whip sound, obviously, is unique in both versions of the game. Anyway, the Japanese version puts emphasis on the chain links, while the US version has a more breathy swing that's more Hollywoodized. Enemies often utter grunts and squeals when struck to help sell the effect of them getting whipped out of existence. And obviously, most of these sounds are distinct. I don't think I think I could hear any of these sounds after having experienced this game and recognize them as a Castlevania sound. They did a lot of work to make sure that you were plenty immersed when you were playing this game through all of the sounds, and they did a great job.
Yeah. When I was going through, so I had to work with this game an awful lot because, I'm putting together all the different videos. I did a whole separate commentary. And one of the things that struck me was how much the game kept giving. For being an 11-staged action game, I still had more that I could have pulled from because I had the whole new game plus to do. And I need different music to play and different shots or different images to use for all the different clips. And the game never faltered, so it just had more and more. And then I would make discoveries like the sound one, where I would stop and go, how many sounds does this game have? And I'm thinking in my head, well, it's probably less than something like Zelda, and then nope, it has more. And then you're thinking, oh, well, it probably has, it's gotta have less enemies variety than Mario, right? I mean, Super Mario World is a much bigger game. Nope, it has, well, it has slightly less, but comparatively, like when you adjust for scope of the game, it's like not a fair comparison at all. So this game is just a powerhouse.
Yeah, they really pushed the limit on multiple levels, which good for them. They definitely accomplished their mission. Kind of wraps up the best sound atmosphere. I think we covered that just in those statistics, but if you have more, please do.
Not for sound. I think that about covers it. It's just, yeah, just give it a listen.
Yeah. Yeah, just throw it on in the background on YouTube or something and just immerse yourself in this gothic world in 1990. I'm
Yeah,
sorry, 1991.
Yeah, this is a game I now play pretty much every Halloween. It gets
Nice.
the Halloween theme going just like nothing else. You got all those zombies and the and then that
Which I must say is not here yet. It is 2 months away, so everybody chill out. We are still in summer.
at the time
That's
of
sad.
recording, not at the time of release. So maybe it is right.
Yeah, well, I can still no. By the time of a release, it's still be summer all year.
I love Halloween.
All right, so shall we get into our? I do too, but summer can stay forever now. So shall we move into our last topic then?
And let's get into it. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that Corbett said that it felt as though the game had something to say, but he seemed kind of uncertain about what that message was, and so I'll try to see if I can put that into words. And the reason it's hard to pinpoint is from the fact that it's not open-ended, and is instead a self-reflective kind of experience. It's a message that isn't captured in words, but is something felt within the player. You watch Dracula's castle crumble in the distance as the sun rises on the horizon, and reflect upon all that you accomplished in your solitary journey. Just as Simon completes his quest on his own, you do much the same as the player. And therefore the meaning you're looking for has already been taken in, but it may take some time for you to fully interpret it. I think as long as you have an open heart, you can't help but feel satisfied.
Yeah, and it's not a traditional save the princess narrative as is common for a lot of those games, especially back then. You're going to fulfill a family duty, and this leans into the idea of repeat playthroughs since Dracula rises up systematically every 100 years, and it requires the Belmont to fulfill what every Belmont before them has done, putting him back to rest. And with that said, I think we've made our point. The reason that it's Best Pixel nominated is that It does a fantastic job of leading you through that experience as your time as Salmon Belmont.
The thing that makes Castlevania 4 so difficult to discuss is that when you go to extrapolate one part of it, you end up finding that you can't, because it's so interlinked with everything else. Every aspect of this game is dependent upon and actively supporting one another. And that makes for a truly enrapturing experience, but it also creates this complication to discuss because you're trying to just pick at the one thing that it does right, and there isn't one thing, it's everything that it does, and it does all of them on an equally strong level. So it's just a real testament to how great of an experience you get with this one. It's definitely holding the most pull in terms of not just categories, but also the projected outcomes. There's at least, I think, 4 categories in which it's holding the lead in terms of most points, and that's more than any other game. So it really is just holding a super strong lead right now.
Goodness.
Yeah. And I mean, that's largely a result of me. But you know, when I was going through the games, I was playing through all of them, and I left Castlevania kind of near the end because I knew that I was already going to put it down for a bunch of stuff, and I remember really enjoying it from before. And when I went back through it again, it just blew my mind all over again. Just how rich of an experience it is. And it's the kind of thing where I actually made a lot of cuts. There were so many games that I really liked this year, and I didn't nominate for things, or if I did, they were very low on the list. And there's a certain satisfaction I think I have right now in putting Castlevania forward as a big pitch, because the more I invested in it and the more I talked about it and wrote about it, the closer I could get to understanding it on that deeper level. And all of that just goes to show of how rich of an experience it is. So it's something that I think I feel really confident nominating, and that's a good feeling, knowing that I did that extra effort to think it through and spend time with it and mull it over and sleep on it to get it to a really informed decision.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have a pretty extensive commentary on it, so I'd hope so.
To kind of borrow a little bit from my commentary, one of the sentiments I think I'm always left with is that in playing a game, especially one that's a little tough, that feeling you get when you complete it, it gives you a small achievement in real life that kind of carries over. Because in the game, you know, it doesn't matter if you beat a video game, nobody cares. But the whole meaning behind it is that it does matter, because you got to feel for a moment, some success. I did that. Whew. I did something good in the world. And so it kind of sends something back positive your way, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's universally felt when you get to the end of this game. And as Corbett said, maybe you don't understand quite what the message was or what that experience was, but you understand it on an instinctual level, I think.
And
Yeah,
the
Prime
hero's
is
journey
correct.
template really helps sell that, because it's something that is so universal, and you just have to visually and thematically tie it into what's going on in the experience, and then you leave the rest alone. So that, again, that restraint for them to not shove it in your face and to just let the game speak for itself is really quite something. And you know, when we're reviewing retro games, I think there can be a tendency to look at them and go, oh, well, they're just so old, they're so dated. But you have to think back, at the time, this was high tech. And so if it's high tech, you know, people are still the same that they've always been. And you can be passionate and pour yourself into, you know, projects at the time. And then you just have to be a little bit more open to receive that message, I think. And I think Castlevania makes it really easy to do that with just how richly detailed it is and how beautifully it pulls everything together from beginning to end.
Yeah, it does a great job. Well, I think that pretty much sums it up. What do you think?
I think it does. So I'll just say that Castlevania 4 is available on Super Nintendo and as part of the Castlevania collection on Nintendo Switch if you're curious to play it yourself. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thanks, Tyler, for coming along.
Yeah, happy to be here. Also, check out Mitch's extensive video on Castlevania, his commentary. It's enlightening.
Oh, thanks. And then Castlevania 4 is up for 12 awards, including Best Pixel at this year's Oscarinas. You can look forward to seeing the winners at the award ceremony this October. And if Castlevania 4 wins Best Pixel, it will mark the beginnings of aesthetic significance and the power of player catharsis.